Welcome to the Peking Playbook podcast, coming to you from the Peking Knowledge newsletter on Substack. My name is Zicheng Wang. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Peking Playbook. This is Zicheng Wang of the Peking Knowledge newsletter. I'm very happy to give a try to my new idea of podcasting. So today, I think is the first of my podcasting series, and I'm talking to Mr. Hu Bo, a research professor and director of the Center for Maritime Strategy Studies at Peking University. He is also the director of South China Sea Probing Institute, a Chinese organization focused on studying the situation in the South China Sea. And we are recording this on Thursday evening, April 3rd, and I'm currently in Princeton, New Jersey, the United States. So, Professor Hu, very nice talking to you.
Hi, it's Chen. Good to see you, and good evening.
Thank you for getting on the podcast. As I just said, this is my first episode, so I hope it goes very well. Can we start by can you give us a self-introduction? I've very briefly introduced you. Can you talk about maybe you are working full-time at Peking University and you are also leading the South China Sea Probing Institute? Maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself. What is your job? How long have you been doing this?
Fine. My name is Hu Bo. I come from School of International Relations Studies in the Peking University, and my research focuses on maritime strategy, international security, and China diplomacy. And as to the specific areas, I study the South China Sea issue, of course. I also leading just as the Zichen's things that the South China Sea strategic situation probably activity, but it's a part-time job actually. I full-time in Peking University, but part-time in the SCSPI.
I see. I'm sure quite some of my listeners have heard of South China Sea Probing Institute. I think this is, correct me if I'm wrong, the only Chinese institutions that have consistently put out well-researched reports, including revealing very detailed data and observations, as well as sharing opinion pieces and studies on South China Sea. You said that's your part-time job. When did the South China Sea Probing Institute start? What was the idea behind the institute? And how many people are working for you? Because you are the leader, the director, and what are the main projects that you guys have been operating?
This initiative has been started in April of 2019. It is just a research network. Actually, we have from different universities and different institutions in China, also abroad. And we have almost 40 or so members of our network. I think it's a new type of think tank in China and also I think in the world. Actually, we don't have full-time researchers. So we just have five administrative staff. Even me, I think I have told you before that I'm part-time job or other vice director also, for instance, Yan Yan from National Institute for South China Studies based in Kaiser Kuo, and Professor Li Xiaolu from Wuhan University based in Wuhan. The reason I make this proposal and this initiative is that as to the South China Sea issue, there are all kinds of fake news and every day. We all know that the maritime domain awareness, the threshold is a little high for normal scholars and for the public. So we want to make an initiative to clarify what happened every day in the South China Sea and follows the policy and activities of related parties to push a more desirable situation in the South China Sea, with a view to maintain and promoting the peace, stability, and prosperity of the South China Sea. So we launched the South SSPI in April of 2019.
I see. One of the reasons that SCSPI has caught my eye, and I guess many abroad, is because you guys have been publishing a lot of very detailed reports, contrasting with many other pieces out of Chinese institutions and researchers and self-styled think tanks. you have a lot of data, and you just mentioned that you have 5 full-time administrative workers at the institution, and there is a broad research network of scholars who are doing all the part-time work there. I think, like, against that background, it is very impressive output. And this also connects to my next question, which is related to your recently published incomplete report on U.S. military activities in South China Sea in 2024. Let's just take that report as an example. Where does the data come from? And what kind of support do you get from, I don't know, maybe various other partners in gathering these data? Or you just keep track of public reports, of news reports? How do you conduct your research? And are there any other parties that have been helping you?
All the data come from the open source and merchants or and business company. So I think what the job we have done is to gather this kind of data and information and digging in the reasonable and effective data to clarify the situation of the South China Sea. So we have what kind of data from China, also from from over the world, and from open source as well as business data. Just as you have mentioned that our methodology are a little different from other think tanks. We use the IT with the data, we use the big data, and we have different backgrounds of scholars. For instance, military strategy and IR, international relations, and international law, and also marine economic development. So we have different backgrounds of scholars from different institutions, and we also have an IT team support for the data analyzing. So we are transdiscipline research.
I see. So you mentioned like commercial data and open source from the merchants. My understanding is that, of course, I'm not an expert in this at all. There are like many shipping companies, and because there are so many maritime activity in the world, so there are like commercially available databases, and that's how you tap your data. And you also go through like the news reports, maybe research from other think tanks. Am I summarizing that correctly?
I think the truth is that there are a lot of data from open source and business company. For instance, the AIS and the ADSB. So every vessel should broadcast their AIS information so we can get information and know what's the location of them. I think the challenge for most think tanks and the institutions that they don't have the technology background. First of all, they don't know how to get the data, and then they couldn't analyzing based this kind of the first data. The first source data are very divided and like pieces of the data. So I think the normal institutions and they don't have background, they couldn't analyzing based on this kind of data.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to this incomplete report on U.S. military activities in South China Sea. This is not your first report of this kind, right? So how long have you been doing this? Like, how many people take part in the production of the report?
I think we release this kind of reports every year since 2019. It means that we have published the report annually from 2018. Usually we publish the report on the last year. So this year we published the report 2024. From 2018, we have 6 reports on U.S. military activities in the South China Sea annually. Just you look how we have mentioned, this report definitely is a joint contributions where we have, I think, almost 20% has contributed on this report. They have different backgrounds, computer science, and the military strategies, and in the IR, and as well as international law.
Sure. So that's sounds like a massive effort for me. So the next question is, why do you focus on like U.S. military activities in South China Sea? Why not some
Well,
other subjects?
the reason is very easy because the U.S. military is a superstar in the South China Sea. There are also other military activities from as regional powers such as Australia and Japan, but their military activities couldn't match the scale and frequency of the United States. I think even China for a long time, China's military activities couldn't match the United States in the South Sea. So the reason is very easy because US military is the superstar. We should follow the superstar.
That sounds very reasonable. And so you have a number of highlights in the report. And just by the way, I've published basically a summary of the reports in Technology newsletter on March 25th. So if you are interested, you can go to www.technology.com to check it out. But I'd like to hear from the director, from the author of the report. So you mentioned a few things in the report among your key findings. I think the first thing is there is continuously strengthened strategic platforms activities. Can you talk to us about what are the strategic platforms and what do you mean by that? And for example, carrier groups or submarines, and what have you observed when you come to continuously strengthen the strategic platforms?
Yes, in our assessment and in our concept on the strategic platforms, which includes the carrier strike groups and submarines, bombers, and also the artificial ready groups. So includes four categories of these strategic platforms. Why we call this kind strategic platforms, I think because of that, usually this kind of platform, they have strategic consequences. So they are different from normal warships, from normal aircraft. And usually they have the strategic consequences and strategic signal meanings.
So these are not just very big weapons. They carry strategic.
They are just a platform. They a lot of weapons on board, of course.
I see. So you mentioned the U.S. military has continuously strengthened these platforms activities in the South China Sea. So like more of them in South China Sea in the year 2024.
Yeah, it depends on which categories. So this year is very interesting that, for instance, the frequency of carrier strike groups increased while the intensity decreased. And also, the US has planned to deploy amphibious ready groups, and we call ARGs. But in 2024, finally, they couldn't deploy ARGs in the South China Sea because of the logistic issues and because of the factories, the cheap factories. So according to the latest GAO report, it means that the quality problems has faced by ARGs. A lot of problems. For instance, long maintenance cycles, shortage of the spare parts and equipment design defects. On one hand, we say that US is trying to strengthen its strategic platform in the South China Sea, but on the other hand, we also think that this kind of increasing deployment has been approaching to a peak or some limit.
I see. So I think you not just document like the number of the presence of them in the South China Sea, but you also combine with other sources of information. For example, you just mentioned there are some defects with some of the platforms. So you also make educated explanations or your understandings of why they have continuously strengthened some of the strategic platforms activities and some of them didn't show up in South China Sea, huh? And you also
Yes, we just introduce the truth and facts and data, but sometimes we comment why, what's the reason in the background.
that's actually no problem. That's actually what I really appreciate because to be very frank, I read a lot of self-styled research reports, but they are more like just opinion pieces without really very deep base in facts in the sort of numbers you gather. So apart from these, you also mentioned there is a uneven increase of marine and area reconnaissance activities in South China Sea. China has been very much against this sort of recon activities in South China Sea. Can you explain what is the uneven increase?
In the every year, U.S. military send land-based aircraft to conduct the closing reconnaissance against China. Every time, there may be 1,000 sorties of this kind of closing reconnaissance missions. And actually, besides that, U.S. also has the ship-based and vessel-based aircraft, for instance, from the aircraft carrier. They also conduct this kind of mission. So just to take the land-based aircraft closing reconnaissance, for example, I think the number is very foolish. Actually, China doesn't object U.S. closing reconnaissance, but I think China's objection is that sometimes this kind of missions are too close and too aggressive. For instance, sometimes this kind of aircraft, when they conduct the closing reconnaissance missions, they are approaching China's territorial airspace, even in the mainland airspace. So it is very aggressive. In this kind of situation, the PLA must respond. But for the most of their activities outside China per se, for instance, in the EEZ, I think the PLA just follow and monitor this kind of activities. So I think as according to our observation and analyzing, I think are different from the normal news and the normal media's reports in China that politically China doesn't like this kind of closing reconnaissance. Militarily and technically, I think China, most of the situation, China just follow and monitor. Only in several situations, I think China, the PLA will respond very harshly based on international practice. So it is not just a legal issues, it is a political and national security issues. So I think China and US have different understanding of this. This is, I think, we call the area closing reconnaissance. There are also maritime survey reconnaissance, maybe not currently, but I think the marine survey this year, I think the area closing reconnaissance is very stable compared with the last year and last several years, for instance, 2022 and 2023. But the maritime reconnaissance activities has been improved maybe 2 times compared with the last year. Totally, there are 706 ship days in activities bypassed the duration in 2023 significantly. The simple thing is that every day there are 2 civilian vessels conducted reconnaissance activities in the South China Sea in last year.
I see. Okay. So every day there are 2 surveillance vessels from the US military in South China Sea conducting maritime.
And I think that three and 4 military aircraft in the air.
I think most of them are not in the news. And also what you just mentioned very pointedly, and I think that's something I'm very grateful that you corrected my question at the very beginning, is that I'm not an expert in this, but my impression was like China is basically flatly against all sorts of US military recon missions in this area. But as you just pointed out, the response from the People's Liberation Army basically depends on different situations. For most of the time, it's just monitoring, and only when it approaches China's territorial airspace would the Chinese Air Force respond, like with airplanes. And that's what makes news, is to intercept US military planes. I think even that specific point would be, worth another podcast, because it's something always in the news. It's something that's prone to create real crises and conflicts. And the people do not understand those kind of technical details very much. But yeah, we are reviewing this incomplete report. So let's move on to
I
the.
think, yes, I want to add some information that actually, I think just as you mentioned, the details information is very important to judge who is right and who is wrong based on truth and fact. The problem is that most of the public and even the scholars, they don't know the real situation is. So I respond to our US colleagues that South China Sea is too large. You are complaining that your vessels, your aircraft has been intercepted by BLA. Besides the complaint, you should also tell us where this kind of incidents happen. If you are just around the Thailand island or Guangdong coastline, you have reason to be intercepted.
I see. The devil is always in the details. What you just mentioned, it reminds me of like discussions between the Chinese interlocutors and, for example, international media. And the Chinese would say the U.S. media are very unfair when it comes to China reporting, and U.S. journalists and international media journalists will say, well, you should tell me which exact piece and where exactly am I unfair to you? Yeah, it's
Yes.
always this sort of details that for people really in the business that they need to figure out exactly. And okay, not to dwell on this for too long, let's move on to the next part of your report, which is you observed low frequency declaratory operations. And many of us have heard of the term. It's called freedom of navigation operations, as well as transits across the very sensitive Taiwan Strait. So basically, your report observes that the frequency of such operations of the US military has declined. Is that correct? Or what have you been like observing?
Yes, you are right. In our report, we talk about this issue very specifically because U.S. military has conducted the follow-ups we call the freedom of navigation operations. There are many categories of follow-ups. It means that there are different categories of follow-ups. The medias and the public, I think, focus just one category of follow-ups. It is our report mentioned the island or feature intrusive freedom navigation operations. This kind of operation means that the U.S. military entered the Gulf nautical miles or territories, the features occupied by China. So actually, you have say that this kind of news that many people are not counting the numbers of follow-ups. Actually, it is difficult to count because U.S. doesn't release the numbers and the frequency of the most categories of the follow-ups. Only on the island and the feature intrusive from freedom navigation operations you can count. If you count in this way, actually the number decreased in 2024. But it doesn't mean the US follow-ups generally has decreased. Just this kind of categories decreased. And Taiwan transit, US has a specific term on Taiwan Strait transits. So Taiwan Strait transits is not categories of follow-up. I think many people has misunderstanding on these issues. Taiwan Strait and transit is another we call narratory operations. Why we call these two operations narratory operations is that in the US, I think the US military doctrine, I think US use this kind of operations to could declare something. For instance, the US use the follow-ups to challenges other countries, the US courts, the excessive maritime claims of other countries. So that's the means of declaratory operations.
I see. Let me put it in simple English, or ordinary English. This sort of freedom of navigation operations are political in nature. And of course, the US, their public explanation is we will sail wherever international law allows. So they want to make a statement, they want to register a mark, they want to go there and also, very importantly, publicly say, we have been there. That's what you mean by the declaratory operations, right?
Yes. Therefore, they are just for political and diplomatic meanings, just for military meanings.
And of course, the US enjoys a vast network of allies in the Asia Pacific region. And although the latest tariff moves out of the White House may actually jeopardize their ties with quite some of these allies, but you observed that there are continuously boosted number and intensity of joint operations with the militaries of US allies in the South China Sea. Can you shed a little more light on that?
Yes, I think it is a very important convenience for the United States to check China's rising in the South China Sea as well as the West Pacific. U.S. has advantages of the U.S. has a lot of airlines. So I think the U.S. has been the Even since the Obama administration, I think the U.S. has increased the bilateral and multilateral military cooperations with allies. I think to build some unilateral military alliances, a network against China, for instance, the AUKUS, and also the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines and cooperations. I think in the last final year of the term, the Biden administration used the Philippines as I think as a fulcrum in the South China Sea disputes and around, and continue to strengthen bilateral and multilateral military cooperation. So we see a lot of joint military exercise. For instance, the scale and numbers of joint military exercise has been rising a lot compared with last year. So besides the Philippines, I think the joint operation with Japan, Australia has also been increased in the frequency, intensity, and as well as the scales of the military operations. And also, I think the U.S. has used the alliance network to strengthen regional maritime domain awareness. In sum, I think the joint activities and joint operations with allies in this area would be highlighted even in the future. I think because the U.S.'s own capabilities just as I mentioned before, its own capabilities in this area has been outstretched. And the U.S. has already deployed 60 and 70% of overseas air and maritime forces, conventional air and maritime forces, the South China Sea and around. But because of manufacturing industry in the U.S. has decreased a lot, so the U.S. main platforms, for instance, the warships, the aircraft, the numbers, they couldn't increase the numbers quickly in the foreseeable future.
That's why you believe like they're trying to rally their
Yes,
allies,
yeah.
right?
So
Leveraging their
yeah,
allies.
that's true. That's true.
Sure. We will get to the Philippines in a moment, but the last question specifically related to the incomplete report on U.S. military activities in South China Sea 2024 is you also observed there are exercises and the drills for enhancing combat readiness. I'm not a military person. Combat readiness, that seems, very real life, real battle scenarios. And
it is not on news that U.S. is preparing for the worst scenarios in case of the war with the PLA, and they are preparing for this kind of scenarios. So it is not on news. I think especially in the recent years, their exercise, I think, are focused on the readiness of the military combat.
you mentioned, for example, there is unprecedented scale of some exercises in the Western Pacific region, and it's related to the last point we talked about. It's not just the U.S. military's presence and combat capabilities in the region, but also their joint operational capabilities with their allies, because it's two militaries, although they enjoy a very robust relationship, they still need to exercise together. And so this is among the observations you have, right?
Yes.
And there is also increasingly targeted exercise subjects and expanding multilateral exercise alliances. So who are like the major allies and when it comes to this sort of military drills and exercises for combat readiness in the region?
Japan and Australia. So I think the Japan and Australia have played a very important role in this area as in the U.S. deployments and the U.S. plan against China.
I see. Okay, I think we have basically gone through the main findings of the report. Again, if you are interested, you can check out Technology on March 25th, the incomplete report on U.S. military activities in South China Sea in 2024. And also, of course, SCSPI has its own website and its own Twitter account, and you can find all the information over there. But there is one thing I would really want to ask for your insight, and this is something you have just mentioned, and this is also something that's in the news, which is the new Secretary of Defense, Ms. Hegseth, recently just visited the Philippines. And when it comes to the South China Sea dispute, I guess in the past 2 or 3 years, what has been making the headlines is always China is bullying the Philippines. Can you maybe give us like let's not spend an hour on this, but what are the like main reasons for this outbreak of China Philippines standoff in the South China Sea? And it seems like in the past months the situation has stabilized a little bit. So why and what is the latest development?
China and the Philippines, as well as other member states, we have some disputes in the Spirit Islands, and we also have disputes on the maritime limitations. That's the history. So China's claims has never been changed ever since the founding of People's Republic of China. So our claims, the China claims, are very consistent in the South China Sea. I want to emphasize that in the July 12th of 2016, the China's MFA has made a statement repeating China's claims in the South China Sea, which includes four categories. The fourth categories is four SHAs, sovereignties. Four SHA including the Spirit Islands, Paris Islands, the island groups. So first of all, it's the sovereignty of the four SHAs. The second enemy is the internal water and territorial sea of four island groups. That category is EEZ and continental shares generated from the four island groups. And finally is historical rights. So actually, the foreign friends and international media are always talking about the 9-9, and they call the China use the 9-9 to claim the waters and islands in the South China Sea. It is not true. Actually, 9-9 is not China's legal base to claim the South China Sea waters. The 9-9, I think, just depicts the scope of China's claims inside. But 9-9 itself is not the legal base, is not a claims at all. So China's 9-9 is not China's claims. So we should clarify that. I have talked about too much on this issue, but my point is that China's claims on this issue on South China Sea have never been changed. And also, China's policy towards the South China Sea disputes has never been changed. Even now, we are following the Deng Xiaoping doctrine of sharing disputes. But to the Spirit Island disputes that I think China recognized the occupation in the history by other parties. For instance, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and also China recognized that some other claims have the oil and gas development in the disputed areas. China, we recognize the history and we don't want to use force to change the status quo, but we couldn't bear the new losses of for instance, the new features, occupations for instance, by the Philippines. So in sum, China's policy has never been changed. Only change, I think, is China's capabilities and China's resolve to defend its maritime rights and maritime sovereignty in the South China Sea, which is totally different compared with 20 or 30 years before. So China's policy as well as China's claims have never been changed. And the Philippines complicated case that the only reason because the Philippine policy has been changed after the Bambang Marx came into office. I think the Bambang Marx has two kinds of misconclusion on the situation. First of all is that the Bambang Marx thinks that China had a lot of trouble domestically and internationally. So China will not respond to Philippines' challenges in the South China Sea. And also the Bambang Marx administration has misconclusion and I think not realistic expectations on the U.S. support. This thought the U.S. will support them 100% to change China, but the real situation definitely not. And these two kinds of misconclusions on the situations, and plus the Bambang Marx administration's ambitions in the South China Sea. So you will say they are changing and they have tried to change the status quo everywhere in the disputed areas between China and the Philippines. For instance, the Second Thomas Shore and the Sambila Shore and even the Scarborough Shore. So, as I have mentioned before, China recognized the occupation in the history, but China couldn't accept new losses in the South China Sea, in the Spirit Islands. So, when China faced the challenges by the Philippines, China must respond. We have no room to back off. We are just keeping the status quo. China has made very clearly that China doesn't want to occupy the South Thomas Shore and the Sambila Shore. China just worried that the Philippines will occupy these features. So China must keep alert and respond when changes happen.
I see. That's a very long answer. And actually, I have so many questions to many of the issues you've just raised, but we don't have enough time. And I guess I'll invite you to the podcast again sometime in the future.
Yeah.
And can I just ask one more thing? Is like you mentioned the current Filipino president, and he seems to pursue a different approach than from his predecessor, whose name is President Duterte. And there was some sort of, I don't know, gentleman's agreement, right? It's like handshake agreement between China and the Philippines. And the Chinese claim is that tore up or actually didn't agree, didn't acknowledge the very existence of that handshake agreement, the gentleman's agreement, which have kept the peace in the region. Can you give us like a few more details on that?
Actually, the situation nowadays, I think, is much calmer than 2024 and 2023. The reason is that I think after 2 years of challenges against China, I think the Philippines has exhausted its means, its tools, and its energies to China. So I have written a piece for SSPI on the situation of South China Sea. The main that I think that we have shared details. I think that the Philippines will not stop to change China in the South China Sea. But I think the Philippines couldn't do something big without U.S. direct support. So after 2 years of interaction with China, I think the Philippines finally realized that China is very serious. It's very serious and to respond to Philippine changes. And there are no space and no room for the Philippines to advance in West Philippines Sea. So to some degree, I think, to a certain degree, I think the Philippines has finally realized the situation. For instance, you have mentioned that China and the Philippines had using the diplomatic channels to calm down the situation of the South Thomas Shore and the Sambila Shore. Especially for the South Thomas Shore, you know that I think the situation had back to the normal of 2022 before 2023. It means that China can accept the Philippines transport some daily using materials and foods to grounded warships. But the China couldn't accept the Philippines transporting building material to this grounded vessels. So that means the gentleman agreement. After the Farmer Marx came into office, Farmer Marx has said like this way that there are no this kind of agreement. Even it had. The Philippines can piece it up, can roll it up. So you will say, but now after 2 years of interactions with China, the Philippines finally realized that they couldn't do something more on second from the shore. We are back to the normal, So you will say the diplomatic channels, even in China and the Philippines, diplomatic channels had played a lot of roles. The problem, I think, is as you mentioned that inside the Philippines, there are divided approaches to deal with China. So usually the MFA of Philippines, I think the Foreign Ministry of Philippines, they like to use the diplomatic channel to deal with China and to manage the disputes. But the armed forces, the Philippines Coast Guards, they have a different approaches and they have different intentions to deal with China and to deal with the disputes issues. That makes the situation much complicated.
I see. Just talk about my personal preferences. I would always prefer the diplomats to do the job, not involving the much more threatening Coast Guard or the militaries. And something you just mentioned to that is basically, for example, take the grounded ships, for example. So I guess what you were saying is that, although China totally doesn't accept like the claims based on the grounded ships, but since it is already grounded there and there are Filipino armed forces stationed there, so if you want to ship the food, the drinks, and all these necessary materials to your troops based on the grounded ships, then fine. Basically, if you just do that, China will not object to that. And that's the Chinese version of keeping the status quo. And you mentioned that's basically the Chinese principle, long existing, consistent principle in handling all these disputes in the region. And although the status quo may not fully align with the Chinese claims, but China isn't actually trying to, let's say, just remove the grounded ships. That's not what the Chinese want to do. And based on that, I also have another question is that Philippines have the China-Filipino dispute that's been making the headlines. But of course, there are other South China Sea claimants in the region, including Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. There are press reports which says basically, for example, some country is building artificial islands actually at a very quick pace, and the scale of the construction is actually unprecedented. And there are other oil and gas exploration projects in the region which also actually fall into China's claimed regions. But these projects from other claimants seem to be, let's just say, going under the radar, and Beijing isn't exactly using coercive means such as China's Coast Guard or its military to stop these activities. Why in these issues it seems that China has more tolerance or flexibility and China is not as aggressive as widely painted in Western media? What makes the difference between the China-Filipino dispute and the disputes which are handled much more diplomatically and peacefully between China and other South China Sea claimants?
But before answer this question, I want to add some information on the Second Thomas Shoal. China doesn't recognize the occupation of Second Thomas Shoal by the Philippines. So the situation on Second Thomas Shoal is totally different with other occupied features by the Philippines, by Vietnam, by Malaysia. So that's why when the Philippines had shown the intention to occupy, to consolidate this outpost at the Second Thomas Shoal, China's response are so seriously. So harshly, because at the beginning, China didn't recognize the occupation of Second Thomas Shoal by using the grounded warships. Because at the beginning, in the 1990s, when the Philippines grounded the warship, the Philippine China counterparts that we are just temporarily grounded. We don't want to occupy this feature forever, and we will leave. The results are totally different, especially nowadays after Bambang came into office. So that's different, which touch upon your question about that China has different approaches to Philippines, Vietnam, to Malaysia. I don't think so. I think China's approach is consistent and stable, no matter which country and which claims. The difference is, I think, is not from China, I think from the Philippines. Usually, Vietnam and Malaysia prefer to use diplomatic channels to manage the disputes and the curtain, which is totally different with the Philippines approach. So the difference not come from China, but come from other different claims. Of course, China and Malaysia have, I think, much more frequency of diplomatic changes and the general relationship, I think, are much stable than China. And the other reason I think that is that the Philippines has shown intentions to interference the Taiwan issues. And the Philippines has sided with the US against China, which makes the situation much more complicated than the maritime disputes. So China and the Philippines, I think they have a much complicated background compared with China and Vietnam and China and Malaysia. As to China and the disputes with Malaysia and Vietnam, I think China has using diplomatic channels and other law enforcement activities to challenges and Malaysia's advancements in the disputed areas. But generally, I think thanks to the general good relationship and as well as stable diplomatic channels, I think China and other claimants can keep the situation much better than China and the Philippines. I think as the general situation of South China Sea, China is very serious and very frankly that China wants the South China Sea to be stable and to be peaceful because China benefit from this kind of atmosphere and benefit from the peace and stability of the South China Sea very much. China has kept restraint when facing the changes from Philippines, from Vietnam, from Malaysia, and other claimants. I think if without China's self-restraint, there are no peace and no stability in the South China Sea. Because if just counting on the hard power, I think China can do more things China wants to do. But China didn't do that. The reason is that China wants to have a harmonious relationship with our neighbors. And for this reason, China can keep the restraints and sharpen the disputes and manage the disputes and keep the South China Sea to be a peaceful and harmonious area.
Okay, that's, I think in an hour we've covered a lot of ground. On that note, can I ask, do you have maybe some other highlights and the sort of common misconceptions you want to address in addition to what we have talked about today?
I don't have it. As you're saying that we have covered a lot of issues. Very maybe we should find other opportunities to do more podcast. I only thing I want to say is that I welcome the notice and welcome the follows of our audience abroad because most of members come from China. So I think we, based on the truth and facts, based on the data, I think we Chinese experts have a better position to explain the Chinese policy. So we can also share China's perspective to help you to understand the situation of South China Sea and kill the fake news.
Okay.
Let's kill conditions to kill the fake news. Thanks.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Hu Bo. Thank you for coming to the podcast and become like the first guest of my podcasting series. Huh?
I'm a patient.
Okay, thank you. That was research professor at Peking University Center for Maritime Strategy Studies, where he is the director, and he is also the director of South China Sea Probing Initiative (SCSPI). You are welcome to go to www.scspi.org and check out their Twitter feeds or X feeds, whatever it is called now. So on that note, thank you and thank you for listening.